It began with a single act of curiosity, one man, one letter, one secret that would shatter the fragile illusion of unity. Inside a dimly lit post office in Juba, the hum of ceiling fans mingled with the shuffle of paper as a southern clerk reached for an envelope marked top secret. He didn't know it then, but what he held in his trembling hands would ignite decades of rebellion, reshape borders, and tear a nation in two. This is not just the story of Sudanese, the story of betrayal, of power, and of a dream that was never meant to last. It is July 1955. In the small post office of Juba, Reuben, a southern Sudanese clerk, sits quietly behind his desk, sorting through the day's mail. He works by the faint light filtering through a dusty window, the air heavy with tension and the faint smell of ink. His hand pauses when his fingers brush against an envelope, unlike the rest sealed in thick paper, stamped in red, top secret. He's seen these before. They always carried orders for the northern officials off limits to southerners like him. But this time, something feels different. The curiosity gnaws at him. He knows the risk stealing an official document could cost him his job, his freedom, even his life. Yet, something inside whispers that he must see what the North is hiding. He waits for the right moment. The office grows quiet. Reuben's heartbeat thunders in his chest as he slips the key into a drawer and pulls it open. Inside lies a telegram written in Arabic, dense, official, and unreadable to him. That's when he realizes his next move. He carefully folds the document, tucks it into his bag, and steps out into the scorching Juba afternoon. He needs someone he can trust. That someone is Fraser Ek, a fellow southerner who works at the provincial headquarters, fluent in both English and Arabic, and, like Reuben, increasingly suspicious of the North's intentions. When Fraser reads the telegram, his face drains of color. His hands shake. The message, allegedly from Prime Minister Ismail al-Assad, instructs northern administrators in the south to suppress southerners advocating for federation. For Reuben and Fraser, this is confirmation of their worst fears. The North has no intention of sharing power, no interest in giving southerners a voice in their own future. They take the translated document to a secret southern political committee led by Daniel Jumi and Marco Room, to respected southern politicians in Juba. But word spreads fast in Colonial Sudan. Soon, security agents arrive. Reuben and Fraser are arrested, interrogated, beaten. Yet, the document has already escaped their grasp. It circulates across the south, whispered and photocopied. Stoking deep resentment, that single telegram becomes a spark, one that will soon set Sudan ablaze. August 18, 1955. Independence is just around the corner. But the mood in Sudan is far from celebratory. In the town of Tatort, a military unit known as the Equatorial Corps, made up mostly of southern Sudanese soldiers trained by the British, receives an order. They are to move north to Khartoum without their weapons. The command feels like a trap. The soldiers know what it means to travel unarmed under northern supervision. To obey would be suicide. They refused. The tension erupts when a northern officer, frustrated and angry, fires his gun, killing one of the southern soldiers. The rest retaliate. They storm the armory, seize the weapons, and unleash a violent mutiny that sweeps through the southern towns. Northern officers are killed, posts are attacked, and the rebellion spreads like wildfire. It is the first open revolt between North and South, a warning that the fragile bridge built by colonial rule is already collapsing. The story of why Sudan split in two didn't begin with that mutiny. The seeds were planted decades earlier, when two foreign powers drew a line on a map and called it a partnership. It was 1899. After the British crushed the modest state in Sudan, they pressured Egypt's ruler, Abbas II, into signing an agreement that would reshape the region's destiny. Sudan was to be ruled jointly by Britain and Egypt, strange political marriage known as the Anglo-Egyptian condominium. On paper, it sounded like equality. In reality, Britain called every shot. A governor-general sat in Khartoum, technically appointed by Egypt, but only with British consent. Egyptian flags fluttered, but the British Empire's shadow covered everything. When British administrators moved south around 1902, they encountered fierce resistance from local communities who wanted no part of foreign rule. By 1906, the British introduced a policy called the Closed Districts Ordinance, a bureaucratic term for segregation. Northerners needed permits to enter the south. Merchants, soldiers, and officials from Khartoum were all barred without special permission. The south became a land behind a wall, cut off, deliberately neglected. The the British considered southern Sudan more trouble than it was worth. They invested heavily in the north, building railways, schools, and infrastructure, but left the south to languish. They relied on Egypt's treasury to fund northern projects, while the south received only scraps. Rather than develop it, they sought to control it cheaply, using local chiefs as intermediaries. But this indirect rule quickly fell apart. British officials misunderstood the local customs and ethnic complexities, turning governance into chaos. What emerged was not a united colony, but two nations growing apart under the same flag. At the same time, Britain feared something else: Egypt's growing ambition. A united Nile Valley could threaten their control over the region, and so the British kept Sudan and Egypt apart at all costs. Egypt's ruler, Abbas II, tried to resist but failed. Then came World War I in 1914. Egypt was still technically under the Ottoman Empire, which had joined the war against Britain. That gave the British their chance. They removed Abbas II, labeled him disloyal, and replaced him with his uncle Hussein Kamal, a man far more cooperative. Egypt was declared a British protectorate, the so-called Sultanate of Egypt. But Egypt's people were restless. Nationalists demanded true independence, and by 1922, after protests and bloodshed, Britain gave in. Egypt regained its independence, but Sudan was excluded. Britain refused to unite the two lands, tightening its grip on Sudan and pushing Egypt out completely. By 1924, the rift between North and South deepened even further. The British poured resources into the North, transforming it into an Arab-Muslim elite center, while the South remained rural, impoverished, and isolated. Northern merchants and officials were banned from entering southern territories. The British even tried to block the spread of Islam, promoting Christian missions and discouraging Arabic language in schools. In the South, life stood still. British officers known as bog barons governed the region like distant landlords, living among the locals but doing little to modernize or integrate the land. The South fell further and further behind, economically, politically, and socially. The divide was no accident. It was a policy, a design, a line drawn not on a map, but in the hearts of two peoples who would one day call themselves Sudanese. By the 1940s, resentment was boiling on both sides. Egypt wanted its old territory back. Sudanese nationalists wanted independence from everyone. And Britain, weary from war, began losing control of its empire. Then came 1951, and Egypt's bold declaration: Sudan now belongs to a united kingdom of Egypt and Sudan, under King Farouk. It was an empty gesture. Within 8 months, Egypt's monarchy fell in the 1952 revolution, and the new leaders, Mohammed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser, had different ambitions. They wanted Sudanese independence, not annexation. Britain, eager to keep Egypt friendly, began negotiating Sudan's future. But while Egypt and Britain debated sovereignty, one group remained voiceless: the South. In 1953, northern politicians met in Khartoum to decide Sudan's fate. The Southern Liberal Party, the only group representing the South, wasn't even invited. The message was clear: independence would come, but unity was not up for discussion, and so it did. On January 1, 1956, Sudan became independent, but the celebration that should have united a people instead exposed just how divided they already were. The flag of Sudan rose under the morning sun of January 1, 1956, fluttering proudly above Khartoum as drums rolled and crowds wept with joy. It was the dawn of independence, the end of foreign rule, and the beginning of what many believed would be a new chapter of freedom. But for those in the South, listening from hundreds of miles away, the celebration carried a hollow echo. The dream was theirs too, yet the power was not. The North had taken the throne, and the South was left watching from the shadows. In the new parliament, nearly every seat of influence was filled by Northerners: the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, the heads of finance and interior, all from Khartoum. The Southern representatives, who had pleaded for a federal system to safeguard regional autonomy, were ignored, laughed at, and told to wait. Patience, they said, but the South had already waited for generations. Now, it seemed, independence had simply changed the color of the rulers, not the reality of the rule. Within 2 years, the fragile democracy collapsed. In 1958, General Ibrahim Aboud seized power in a military coup, dissolving the parliament and placing the country under military control. His vision was simple and brutal: a single nation, one culture, one faith. Under Aboud, The campaign to assimilate the South began with ruthless speed. Christian schools were closed, English was banned, and Arabic was enforced as the language of education and administration. Churches were burned, missionaries expelled, and local chiefs replaced by northern officers loyal to Khartoum. The South was to be remade in the image of the North. But resistance does not die easily. It hides, waits, and strikes when the moment is right. By 1959, small bands of southern soldiers and exiles began organizing in secret. They called themselves Inyanya, the name of a deadly local poison. They attacked convoys, ambushed patrols, and melted back into the dense forests of Equatoria. The government responded with fury. Villages were burned, civilians executed, entire communities displaced. The war had begun, though few yet called it that. In the refugee camps of Uganda and Congo, the movement began to take shape. Among the exiles was a young, determined officer named Joseph Legu. It was Legu who would later unite the scattered fighters under one name, the Southern Sudan Liberation Movement. Their demand was not secession but autonomy, a right to govern themselves inside a united Sudan. But Khartoum would not listen. Back in the capital, Aboud's regime was collapsing under its own weight. The economy was faltering, dissent was spreading, and the war in the south was bleeding the treasury dry. In October 1964, after years of repression, students and unions poured into the streets of Khartoum in protest. The uprising became known as the October Revolution, and for a fleeting moment, North and South stood side by side, united not by ethnicity but by anger. Aboud stepped down. The generals withdrew. Sudan returned, briefly, to civilian rule. The new government promised peace. They called for a roundtable conference, inviting northern and southern leaders to finally talk. But the talks dissolved in mistrust and accusation. The North insisted on a single centralized state. The South demanded a federal system. Neither side yielded, and when the meeting ended, the guns spoke again. The war dragged on. Sudan was weary, fractured, and leaderless. Then, in 1969, a young colonel named Jaffa Nimri seized power, promising a new beginning. At first, he spoke the language of reconciliation. He reached out to southern leaders, offered dialogue, and proposed limited For the first time in years, there was a glimpse of hope. In 1972, under the mediation of Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, Nimri and Joseph Legu signed the Addis Ababa Agreement. For the first time since independence, peace descended on Sudan. The South was granted autonomy, its own regional parliament, and authority to govern local affairs. Refugees came home, roads were rebuilt. For a decade, the sound of gunfire gave way to laughter and song. But peace in Sudan was never built to last. As the years passed, Nimri's promises began to fade. The discovery of oil in the southern region changed everything. The wealth that could have united Sudan instead deepened the rift. The question of who would control the oil fields, Khartoum or Jubabi, became a question of survival. Northern politicians and Islamist ideologues whispered in Nimri's ear, urging him to reclaim full authority. In 1983, he did just that. The Addis Ababa Agreement was torn apart. The southern region was dissolved and divided into 3 smaller administrative zones under direct northern control. At the same time, Nimri introduced Islamic law Sharia across the entire country, applying it even in the non-Muslim south. For many southerners, it was the final betrayal. In the town of Buro, a southern officer named John Garang de Mabia received orders to move his battalion north. It was an order that echoed the same command that had triggered the Tatort mutiny nearly 30 years earlier. Garang refused. He took his men, defected, and vanished into the forests. From there, he declared the birth of a new movement, the Sudan People's Liberation Army. This time, the fight was not just for the South, but for an entirely new Sudan, a secular, democratic, and equal nation. Garang's vision was grand, but the war that followed was brutal. Villages burned, millions fled their homes, and starvation stalked the land. The SPLA and government forces both committed atrocities, turning Sudan into one of the bloodiest battlegrounds on the continent. Nimri's regime grew paranoid and desperate. He courted allies abroad, branding the SPLA as communists backed by Ethiopia. But foreign aid couldn't save him. In 1985, hunger and anger swept through the streets. The people rose again, and Nimri fled to Egypt, leaving behind a country in ruin. A transitional government tried to fill the vacuum, but the divisions were too deep. The war raged on. Then, in 1989, another coup struck. Colonel Omar al-Bashir seized power, supported by Islamist leader Hassan al-Turabi and the National Islamic Front. Their message was one of unity under Islam: one nation, one law, one God. For the South, it was a declaration of war. Under Bashir's rule, the campaign of terror reached new depths. Arab militias were armed and unleashed across the South. Entire villages were annihilated, and tens of thousands of civilians were enslaved or driven from their land. The world watched as Sudan sank deeper into darkness, but the tide was shifting. The Cold War was ending, and with it, the political excuses that had allowed Khartoum to act unchecked. By the early 2000s, the SPLA, now led by a seasoned John Garang, had won international sympathy. The United States stepped in to broker peace. After 22 years of war, in 2005, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed. The South was granted autonomy once again, and a referendum on independence was promised within 6 years. For the first time in a generation, there was hope. Garang returned to Khartoum, not as a rebel, but as Vice President of Sudan. Crowds lined the streets to welcome him, singing his name, believing that perhaps, at last, the nightmare was ending. But fate had other plans. 3 weeks later, Garang's helicopter crashed in the mountains on his return from Uganda. He was gone. The grief was unbearable. Riots exploded across the country. Thousands died in ethnic clashes. The man who had carried the dream of a united Sudan was dead. And with him, the fragile bridge between North and South collapsed once more. The war was over in name, but the wound had not healed. What came next would change the map of Africa forever. The day John Garang died, the skies over Sudan felt heavier than usual, as if the land itself was mourning. His helicopter crashed in the Ugandan hills, leaving behind twisted metal, unanswered questions, and a silence that spread faster than the news. To the north, it was a political tragedy. To the south, it was the loss of a savior. People poured into the streets, weeping, burning tires, shouting Garang's name. In Khartoum, riots broke out. Mosques and churches were torched. Neighbors turned on each other, and once again, the promise of peace dissolved into chaos. In the months that followed, Sudan drifted between fragile hope and quiet dread. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement still stood, and so did the promise of a referendum. The world was watching, the United Nations was on the ground, and the people, tired, broken, and skeptical, waited for a chance to decide their own fate. 6 years later, that moment came. It was January 2011. Across the towns and villages of southern Sudan, voters lined up in dusty queues that stretched for miles. Some walked for days to reach polling stations, clutching small ID cards as if holding fragments of a long-lost dream. Old men who had fought in the bush, mothers who had buried children, and young students who had only known war stood in silence, waiting for their turn to mark a ballot paper that asked a single, impossible question: do you want to remain part of Sudan, or do you want to be independent? When the results came, they were overwhelming. Over 98% voted for independence. For a brief moment, it felt as if history had finally kept a promise. On July 9, 2011, South Sudan was born, the world's newest nation. Flags rose, drums echoed across Juba. People danced in the streets, shouting through tears, "Free at last! Free at last!" Fireworks lit the night sky as the anthem of South Sudan played for the first time. But freedom, like fire, burns both ways. Independence brought hope, but also expectation, and beneath that, a deep and dangerous fragility. The unity that had carried South Sudan through the war began to fracture in peace. The old comrades who had fought side by side were now rivals for power in a state rich in oil but poor in everything else. The guns that had once pointed north began to turn inward. The new president, Salva Kiir, a quiet, cautious man from the Dinka ethnic group, stood at the helm of a nation not yet built. His former ally, Riek Machar, and his deputy, grew restless, accusing Kiir of corruption and authoritarian rule. The accusations spread, the trust evaporated, and in December 2013, the unthinkable happened: war returned. This time, it was not between North and South, but South and South. Soldiers split along ethnic lines, and the streets of Juba ran red with blood. Entire towns were emptied, families torn apart, children turned into soldiers. In some places, the killings were so brutal that even those who had survived decades of war against the North said they had never seen such horror. The dream of freedom, collapsed almost as quickly as it had been born. Millions fled to neighboring countries. Famine swept through villages. The oil money that was supposed to rebuild hospitals and schools instead vanished into offshore accounts. Once again, the people found themselves trapped free on paper, enslaved by corruption, greed, and the ghosts of their past. The world, which had once celebrated South Sudan as a triumph of self-determination, now watched with quiet despair. The blue helmets of the United Nations dotted the landscape, not as symbols of peace, but as witnesses to a tragedy unfolding in slow motion. In the north, Sudan, under al-Bashir, faced its own reckoning. Years of dictatorship, sanctions, and internal rebellions brought the economy to its knees. In 2019, after months of protests and civil disobedience, Bashir was finally overthrown. Crowds filled the streets of Khartoum, waving flags, chanting for freedom, demanding an end to decades of fear. But even in his fall, the old system lingered, generals and warlords jockeying for control, civilians still fighting to breathe in the space between revolutions. By 2023, Sudan was once again descending into chaos. Rival military factions turned the capital into a battlefield, echoing the same story the world had heard before: power, greed, and betrayal. And somewhere to the south, the young nation that had been born out of so much pain remained trapped in its own circle of suffering. Two countries, two flags, two governments, but one history, one wound. A line drawn by colonizers more than a century ago had split not just the land, but the soul of a people. The British had left, the Egyptians had withdrawn, but the divisions they nurtured, the North and South, Arab and African, Muslim and Christian, remained like scars carved into the earth itself. And yet, amid the rubble and the ruin, hope still refuses to die. In Juba, children walk to school barefoot, carrying books in languages their parents never learned to read. In Khartoum, young poets recite verses about peace, unity, and forgiveness. Across the borderlands, farmers return to their fields after the rain, planting seeds in soil that has seen too much blood. They plant anyway, because to live in Sudan or South Sudan is to believe, against all reason, that tomorrow might be kinder than today. Perhaps that is the true story of Sudan, not of borders drawn or treaties broken, but of endurance. A land that has been divided, beaten, and betrayed, yet still finds a way to rise. As the sun sets over the Nile, the water glows red and gold, flowing quietly through both nations, as if reminding them of what they once shared: a single river, a single heartbeat, a single home. The men who wrote the lines on maps are long gone, but the people who live between them remain, still dreaming of unity, still yearning for peace. And one day, maybe, when the last gun falls silent and the dust settles over Juba and Khartoum alike, the world will remember not the wars that tore them apart, but the courage of those who refused to stop believing that a divided land could still heal. Because in the end, history does not belong to those who divide, belongs to those who endure.